for a long time. All right, well, good evening, all. We're going to go ahead and get started with our adult Bible study again tonight. Welcome back as we jump back into Genesis chapter chapter 30. That's a flyby. Right, that's right. Everybody knows that I don't move anywhere near that fast. That had to be a typo. No, chapter 30, we're picking up in verse 25. So the end of chapter 29 through the first half of chapter 30, we get Jacob's 7 years where he is serving after his marriage. So he serves for 7 years, and they go by like a blink of an eye because he's so in love with Rachel, and he's looking forward to the day of his matrimonial happiness. And then, of course, we know he wakes up the morning after and finds out it's not Rachel. And so he makes the deal with Laban that he'll serve for another 7 years in return for Rachel's hand in marriage, for real this time. And during those 7 years, the end of chapter 29 and on to verse 24 in chapter 30, he serves for 7 years, and he has 11 of his 12 children in those 7 years. And so that section we went through the last couple of weeks is all taken up in this ongoing family dispute, this interpersonal battle between Rachel and Leah and their maids Bilhah and Zilpah, and they're vying for supremacy in the family. They're looking at the world's model for what success is, for what happiness should be, and they're completely engaged in that to the point where they're naming their children in order to agitate and put a burr under the saddle of each other as that goes along. And so there's a very high degree of tension through that passage. You feel knotted up as you read through it and see all of this family dispute that's going on. And then we finally come this evening to verse 25 of chapter 30. Verse 25 of chapter 30. And we read in the first couple of verses here, "And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service, which I have done for you.'" So Jacob comes to the end of this 7 years of marriage, serving Laban. It's 14 years in total he's been serving Laban at this point. Laban has gone from being a mildly wealthy man to, we're going to find out here shortly, a very wealthy man. As Jacob has been very successful, God has blessed everything that Jacob has done in Laban's service. And so he reaches this point in his life where he says, all right, I've paid off, I've fulfilled my duties, and I have paid off my debt, the bride price for both Rachel and Leah. And now I'm ready to depart. I came here to flee from Esau's wrath and to find a wife. Well, here he is 14 years later. He has 2 wives and 2 concubines, 11 children, and he reasons that Esau's wrath is now behind him and it's safe to return to his home country. And we see in this something of the longing to return home here. It's interesting, Abraham leaves Ur of the Chaldees. He's a wanderer. He's a sojourner. He's never has a place really to call his own. He lives in tents outside of the cities and moves around all over in Canaan. A couple of times he leaves Canaan and goes down to Egypt and then comes back during various famines in the land. Isaac really follows the same pattern. He never wanders outside of Canaan, but he wanders in Canaan for his entire life, and he never really has a place that he settles in for an extended period of time. And that's how Jacob grows up. And when he's about 60 years old, and Isaac thinks he's coming close to the end of his life, they have the circumstance where Jacob steals the blessing away with his mother's assistance, and Esau is outraged by that. So Jacob flees, and even though they have been wandering and they've been sojourning and they've been living in the tents and they've never really had a place that's theirs. In fact, to this day, remember, Abraham owns exactly 1 piece of ground in all of Canaan. The field where he buries Sarah. That's it. He's got 1 field and the small cave that's on that they're using for a burial plot. And so that's all they own in all of Canaan, and they don't actually camp there very often, it seems. I'm not clear on the reason for that, but for whatever reason, it's not like they set up in that field and that's now the new city where Abraham keeps all of his livestock and everything, but that's the one piece they own. And in spite of that, in spite of the fact they've been wanderers the whole time, Jacob's heart is yearning for home. He served his 14 years, and I think largely because of his experience when he leaves Canaan, meets God at Bethel, and God gives him the vision and reaffirms to him the promises, the covenant that he will bless Jacob, that he will increase his family, and that he will give him the land in which he now is. Jacob's had that on his mind all this time. And so he's longing for home. And so once the bride price is paid for, Jacob goes to Laban and says, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. I've served you, I've fulfilled my vows, even though the original agreement was for 7 years and you really swindled me out of the next 7 years." Jacob faithfully fulfills that vow, and now he's ready to return home. Verse 26, he says, "Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you." He's confident. He says, "My record stands for itself. I've served you faithfully. You have nothing to complain about. Everything that I've touched has been blessed. Now let me take my family and go in peace." Look at Laban's response. Verse 27. Jacob, it would seem, should be this is a more than fair request. But pick up verse 27. "And Laban said to him, 'Please stay if I have found favor in your eyes. For I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake.' Then he said, 'Name me your wages, and I will give it.'" You know, Laban's a little bit of a slimy guy here. Laban's been a little bit of a slimy guy almost every time we've come into contact with him. But here's Laban. Jacob says it's time to go. Laban knew this day was coming. It's not like he doesn't have a calendar and can't do math. He knows the time is coming. He knows when the day is going to arrive that Jacob is going to want to return to his own country. He's going to want to take his family and no longer be working for Laban as the bride price for Rachel and Leah. And so Jacob comes and says that, and what's Laban's response? Laban here has tricked Jacob into marrying Leah when he meant to marry Rachel, and he's really been very dishonest with Jacob already to this date. Jacob has doubtless seen him in his business practices. You know, when I lived in the South, there's this interesting phenomena. When you live in the South, it is culturally acceptable, particularly in the southeastern United States, to be Christian. It's culturally acceptable. Half the people who you talk to who have a business card or have a business sign up have a little fish on the corner of it. Now you find out when you actually do business with those people which ones of them actually act like Christians and which one of them just have the fish on it because it's culturally acceptable to do so. Jacob had served Laban for 14 years. Laban has honeyed words, but Jacob can't possibly have missed how Laban does business. Laban is a guy who is self-centered, who's all about what he can get. He's not above cheating. He's not above stealing. He's not above taking advantage of anyone any way he can. And Jacob doubtless knows that. But listen to what Laban says, these honeyed words. "Please stay if I have found favor in your eyes." Whew. Boy, has Laban found favor in Jacob's eyes? I wouldn't think so. I do not want to mitigate Jacob's responsibility for his family problems, but in our human way, we like to rationalize things. And so it would be very easy for Jacob in this moment to rationalize and say, you know what? All of my family problems started when Laban tricked me into marrying the wrong girl in the first place. That would be a very human response. I would be shocked if Jacob never had that thought cross his mind. And so here's Laban, if I have found favor in your eyes, and he gives himself away a little bit here. Is it that he just loves having his daughters and his grandchildren around so much that he's really fallen in love with his son-in-law and he gets along well with his son-in-law and, I want you to stay in the family business? For I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. You know what, Jacob? My business has never done so well than when you were running it for me. I've been in business for a long time before you showed up, and the business never did so well. I don't want you to go anywhere, Jacob. I want to hang on to you. Now, we live in a world where there's a lot of competing pressures in the marketplace. But one of the things that I've always believed is true, and I still believe is true, is that if you take good care of your good people, you don't have to worry about them going anywhere. People appreciate that. Even if it's not the top dollar they could possibly make anywhere, if they're well taken care of and appreciated, they have no worries about going anywhere. And so you make them a generous offer. You make sure they're comfortable. You make sure they're taken care of. What's Laban do? In a moment when he's desperate to keep Jacob, and his response probably should be, here, let me give you, you've worked for me faithfully for 14 years, from a business perspective, in a sense, for free. Those 14 years were paying the bride price. They didn't cost his business anything. This is the time when you could say, look, let me give you a generous wage. Let me join you into the family business. But instead he says, "What? You tell me, what would it take for you to stick around?" He's counting on Jacob's character, that Jacob's not going to over-ask, that Jacob's going to give him kind of the bare minimum number of what it would take to keep him around. And that's what Laban's desperate to figure out. What's the bottom line? How low can I get this and still keep Jacob so the business keeps prospering, so the herds and the flocks continue to flourish? So he says, name me your wages and I will give it. We're going to find out in a little while here that it's not anywhere near that clear cut. Laban goes on and they heckle and bicker about Jacob's wages for the next 6 years. In fact, Jacob says, at the end of the whole thing, Jacob says, as he's getting ready to leave, Laban's changed my wages 10 times since I came to him. Now, if you want to be really generous to Laban, you could say that Rachel and Leah were 2 of those times. So that means in 6 years, he changes them another 8 times as Laban's trying to negotiate and find a way to pay Jacob that doesn't hurt quite so much. That's the kind of businessman that Laban was in this scenario. And so he's desperate to keep Jacob. Look at verse 29. Jacob's response here, we see a lot of growing up has happened in Jacob at this point. His character is by no means perfect. We still see some faults and flaws. But he's done a lot of growing up since the days when he connived with his mother to steal Esau's birthright, or to steal the birthright away rather than confronting his father and doing it rightly. And so verse 29, so Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I provide for my own house? Jacob's response here is interesting. He sets the stage. He starts off by kind of agreeing with Laban. You know what my service has been to. You know what my record is. I agree with you. You have been blessed while I've been here. Notice, though, Laban says that God has blessed him for Jacob's sake. Jacob just says, the Lord has blessed you since I got here. Jacob says, look, I didn't do anything to make that happen. I just did what I was supposed to do. That's a God thing. God chose to do that. That's God's choice. That's his sovereign care. It's not like I set out here and said, look, God, I want you to make Laban rich while I'm here. That was a side benefit of God's blessing to Jacob. I think in a certain sense, that is the outpouring of God's promise to Abraham. And wherever Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and ultimately we'll see the same thing in Joseph's life. Remember, what's God's promise to Abraham, specific to his family and his people? In blessing, I will bless you. Wherever you turn your hand, whatever you do, whatever course you take, I'm going to pour out a blessing on you that's more than normal, that's abundant beyond what is normal in the lives of men and women. And so Jacob's there, and he says, look, you know what the record's been. I've been here. I've served faithfully. I've done what I was supposed to do. And God's done what God does. But I'm not taking credit for that. But he comes to this last phrase here, and he says, and now, when shall I provide for my own house? He served 14 years for no wages other than paying off the bride price for Rachel and Leah. 14 years where his household family needs would have been met. They would have had food on the table as part of the family. But he's accumulated no wealth, no property, no substance of his own in those 14 years. And in that time, he's gone from being a single young man who can set out on his own and trek across the desert up to Haran without anybody with him, to now he's an entourage of 2 wives, 2 concubines, undoubtedly other servants, and 11 sons, at least 1 daughter that we know of, and almost certainly other daughters. He has a substantial house. The other piece of that is, remember, we have this kind of vision in our minds, or at least I did before I spent a lot of time in this text. You always see the flannel graphs. Everybody who remembers the flannel graphs? You got the green background and the flannel graph figures, and like every Sunday school teacher ever had a set of those. I don't know where they came from, but there was a time in independent Baptist churches where I think it was a requirement to have a set of those to teach Sunday school. Oh, that's where they came from then. Right, okay, so they came with the RBP curriculum. Now I know. Right, the mystery, inquiring minds want to know. So how old is Jacob in the flannel graph while you're telling this story? He's every single one of those flannel graphs, he's a young man. But how old was he actually? We talked about this when he travels up to Haran. He was 60. Right, well, not quite by the dictates of their time, but yeah. He was not an incredibly young man. Now, 14 years have passed. He's in his mid-70s. He's got a family of 10 who are all very young, 11 boys who are all very young, plus presumably daughters, wives, servants in the family. And he's starting to say, I need to do something to provide for my family. I've been doing this, but I haven't accumulated. I haven't provided for them any. And there's a mindset difference there that's different from our mindset today, too. You know, we tend to think of an inheritance as something that generally, you know, mom and dad pass away and you sell the house and there's whatever, a little bit to split up between the kids, or one of the kids inherits the house, or however that works out. But when we talk about inheritance, what do we usually think of? That's something rich people have, right? They pass on a large inheritance to their children. The mindset of the day was that was what you were working for, was to build up the family flocks and herds, the farm, the business, whatever it was. And the goal was to build that so that you could pass it on to the next generation. And so here's Jacob looking at his 11 sons and thinking, boy, if you pass along a small flock of sheep to 11 sons, each one of them gets about a lamb and a half to take with them when the time comes. And it's not much to start them out in life on their own. And so he has that mindset that he's looking to provide for his family. And he also comes up in a context of having grown up in the household of Abraham and Isaac. He knows what a large inheritance looks like. He knows what a large family property looks like. And so he has this mindset that he needs to provide for that. So he ends his statement there, the end of verse 30, Now, when shall I also provide for my own house? Verse 31 opens with Laban repeating himself, what shall I give you? All right, you've made your case. You've been a blessing to me. You've been a faithful servant in my household. You've made the case to me that God has blessed while you have been here, and now you need to provide for your own family, so what shall I give you? Jacob says, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep and all the brown ones among the lambs and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes before you, everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. Jacob says, look, I've got a proposition for you, Laban. I want to build up my own flocks and herds. I want to start something for my family that will provide for my family. But rather than me having my flocks here and you having your flocks there and constantly having this argument about how many sheep were in your flock and how many sheep were in my flock and the accusations going back and forth, you see, he knows a little bit about what Laban's like. He foresees those accusations coming. He says, so here's what I'll do. I'll wander out through the flock, and all of the funny-looking ones, the ones that aren't nice white sheep or nice even brown goats, I'll take all the funny-looking ones, speckled and spotted and streaked, and I'll take all of those, and those will be my wages, and that'll be my flock. My flock will be the funny-looking ones. You keep all the nice ones. And then when time to come, if anybody ever has any question about whether I've got any sheep that should belong to you or you've got any that should belong to me, all we got to do is go look at the flocks. If there's any nice even white ones or nice even brown goats out in the field, hey, those are Laban's sheep. Go put them over in his flock. And if there's any speckled or spotted ones, they belong in Jacob's flock. So he's not just making an agreement that I'm going to get all the speckled ones today. He's making an agreement that as long as I work for you, every nice, even-colored animal that's born in my flock, I give to Laban. And every speckled and spotted and streaked and funny-looking one goes from Laban's flock to Jacob's. This has a couple of advantages. It immediately sets up a system where there can't be any arguments about whose sheep are supposed to be whose sheep, whose goats are supposed to be whose goats. Everybody can go look for themselves. It's obvious the moment you look out over the flock if there's any that don't belong there. Not only that, this sets up a pattern that he knows Laban is going to like the sounds of. In their culture, in their day, those, I say the funny-looking ones, I'm not being sarcastic. That's how they viewed it. Those were the less desirable animals. They weren't looking for that. They wanted nice, even, nice coats that didn't have any speckles or spots or defects or anything in them. They wanted good-looking animals, and those were somewhat rare. Not only do we have historical accounts to that, but think about it for a moment. If that was half the flock, would Laban have agreed to it? Not a chance. That's a fairly small piece of the flock. And so Jacob knows from the outset, Laban's going to go for this. He'll be just fine with this arrangement. And so it's an easy ask to set up his wages in this way. Vonnie? God is and yeah. God is in this, and we're going to see that Jacob does, I think. So there's some interpretation here. This is Ben's opinion. I think at the outset here, Jacob has very good intentions. He's making Laban a very fair offer, and he's looking back on the 14 years that he's served, and he says, you know what? God has blessed whatever I've done. God can bless that, and I'll be in God's hands. God will make all the speckled and spotted and streaked sheep he wants to, and God will bless me how he wants to bless me. That's in God's hands. We're going to see a little bit later on that he doesn't entirely leave it in God's hands. His old tendencies kind of start to creep back in. But I think he starts this with good intentions. I think from the outset, he desires that this would be a God-honoring way to go, and that he trusts that the God who's been blessing Laban on his behalf for the last 14 years is going to keep blessing Jacob in the years to come. And so he makes that offer. He sets up this system before him that's a very fair system. It's a system that Laban, obviously, from the outset, Laban thinks he's going to get rich off of this. He's looking at this and he says, look, Jacob's going to take all the speckled and spotted ones. They won't be in the flocks and the herds to breed anymore. So there's going to be very few speckled and spotted ones in my flock going forward. So this is a very low-risk proposition in Laban's mind. This is an easy way to keep Jacob working for him that doesn't have a lot of overhead. Verse 34, look at Laban's response. And Laban said, "Oh, that it were according to your word." Laban is hook, line, and sinker. Verse 35, so he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, everyone that had some white on it, because the goats tended to be black or brown. And so if they had white, that would be the speckles, the spots, the streaks on the goats. And all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hands of his sons. And so the sheep tend to be more light-colored, white-colored, cream-colored, and the goats tend to be brown and black. And so that's what he's talking about, the goats that have the white spots on them and the sheep that have the dark spots on them. So he takes all those, and Jacob gives them into the hands of his sons, who are, the oldest of them is 6.5, 7 years old. That says something for how he raised his sons. Apparently, Reuben and the other boys have been out in the field enough that he trusts that they can take care of the flock at an age of 6 or 7 years old. They were working out in the field with him. And so he takes and he gives them into the hands of his sons. Verse 36, then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. So Laban then removes, and they can't move their camps, so there's a couple of days' journey between them so that the two flocks aren't intermingling. From Jacob's perspective, this is a little bit of breathing room. From Laban's perspective, this is an assurance that none of those speckled and spotted sheep and goats are going to come back in and breed in his nice, even-colored goats and sheep and create more speckled and spotted ones. That's his worry here, is he doesn't want to make more speckled and spotted ones. And so they divide everything up. And at the end of verse 36, they've separated. They're just outside Haran, about 3 days' journey between the two encampments. And Jacob is taking care of Laban's flocks, and Jacob's sons are taking care of his own flocks. Some time goes on. We don't know exactly when in this process it starts, but between verses 37 and the end of the chapter down to verse 43, 6 years goes by. So this is a period of 6 years from the time he makes this agreement with Laban, and they divide the flock at the end of verse 36, down to the end of the chapter. And so the chapter moves on, and we read in verse 37, now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, and peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters and the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked and speckled and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the streaked and all the brown in the flock of Laban, but he put his own flocks by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flock. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, camels, and donkeys. Right, so this is one of those passages where I'm going to stick my... disclaimer is probably not the right word, but I'm going to stick my reminder in here. Remember, God reports accurately on what people say and do and think, even when those people are wrong. And so here's Jacob, somewhere in this process, throughout the course of the 6 years. We don't know if this started instantly or if it takes a little bit of time, or the timing's not laid out for us here. But somewhere during this 6 years, Jacob decides he's not just going to trust that God is going to take care of the size of the flock, and he starts trying to help. Old habits are old habits. It would be a little much to expect that Jacob would change overnight. We know our own hearts. That's not how that works. Very rarely is that the case. Usually that's an ongoing process. And so Jacob here, he resorts to an old shepherd's, these would be superstitions, old wives' tales, that shepherds believed in, and God is accurately reporting that Jacob used. God is not saying that this actually works. If you go peel strips off of poplar branches and almond branches and put them in front of sheep and goats, it doesn't make them have speckled and spotted lambs and kids. It just doesn't. What's that? Doesn't make them conceive either, right? So there's basically, there are three halfway plausible explanations that Jacob may have believed. There's a lot of wild hair theories. If you read enough commentaries, there's a lot of, the weirder the passage is like this, the more the commentators, in my opinion, like to get lost in the weeds on all kinds of weird stuff. So one of them says that Jacob believed that there was something in these sticks that somehow was making them have speckled and spotted lambs. And so he's putting the sticks out. He very clearly, verse 41, believes that's true because he starts putting the sticks out only when the strongest animals are in season. And so he doesn't put them out when the weaker animals are, because he's trying to get the better part of the flock into his flock and herd. And so he very clearly believes that he's having an impact here. So he may think that this causes them to have speckled and striped young. Another theory is that they may have believed that this was something that would cause the animals to go into heat and come into season, as it were. We won't get into all the nuance. The farmers know what that means. And anyway, that also is not true, but he may have thought that and been trying to manipulate it so that he was getting the right animals in season in the right time. And then the third one, this one he may have thought, but I think is the funniest. A couple of commentators suggested that he hoped that by putting the striped sticks, because remember it says he peels strips off the sticks, that somehow by a matter of visualization and mind over matter, that it would cause the animals to have striped and streaked and speckled young, because they were looking at, yeah, that was my response, Jim. You kind of like, okay, maybe he did think that. I don't know. Barry? Mm-hmm. And then they could control the rams that were leaving. Right. They would stand and and stare at it? They would think it was a snake or something in the water, so they'd stand still so that they could get the right ram to... Okay. See, that's the best explanation I've ever heard. Yeah. So that's entirely, maybe that's what this is. Maybe that's Jacob. He puts the sticks out, and then the lambs or the ewes get looking at it, and then Jacob is controlling which ram is involved in the process here in order to try and up his chances of getting speckled and spotted. But regardless of the exact mechanics, how Jacob thinks this works, what's glaringly evident here is Jacob feels like he's controlling the process. He goes from making this deal that by all outward appearances is a great deal for Laban, and at some level he must be trusting that God is going to take care of him through this, and he decides that he's going to help a little bit. That is a very human tendency. We do that all the time. That's something we really, as humans, we're really good at saying, all right, God, I'm going to put that in your hands, and then about 10 seconds later, what are we doing? Yeah, we're over there and we're fiddling with it and trying to make it come out the way we want again. And so here's Jacob. He's set this process up. He's come up with this good idea. It's a rather clever offer that he makes to Laban, and that he knows Laban's going to go for it. He's trusting that God's going to provide for him. And takes away any chance at an argument between them over whose flocks belong to whose. And so he's thought of all the angles, and he makes his preparations, and he goes for it. And then during the course of the 6 years, he starts fiddling with the process and saying, you know what, God, it'd be nice if my flock grew even faster. It'd be nice if my flock was all the stronger animals and not just whichever ones. And so he starts monkeying with the process, and it goes on. Verse 43, we end the chapter on this note. At the end of 6 years, thus the man, Jacob, became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So in 6 years, he goes from no property of his own, or very, very little. He has his immediate household, and he has the provisions that they have as a part of being part of the family, to being exceedingly prosperous. God blesses abundantly. Whatever Jacob may have thought was going on, whatever manipulations he was doing here, it's clear God is the one who is sovereignly blessing Jacob. God is carrying out his promise to Abraham through Jacob, that in blessing he would bless him, that he'd make a great nation out of him. And Jacob is on the cusp of really this population explosion, this immense growth that will take place among his descendants here in the near future. And so Jacob goes through these 6 years. He serves Laban for 6 years. We get to the end of that time, and we slip over into chapter 31, and I want to pick up just with the first 3 verses there, because that really gives us this transition. Chapter 31, verse 1, now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all his wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable toward him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. So for 6 years, Jacob serves Laban. In those 6 years, they follow the plan. We're going to find out in a little while. You get into a little bit of Jacob reports on the situation here. And so there's some of what Jacob says that it's not entirely clear whether he's telling the whole truth throughout this passage. But he reports on it that Laban changes his wages on a number of occasions. It certainly becomes clear at the end of those 6 years that where at the beginning Laban was desperate to keep Jacob around. What do I have to give you? Almost name your price. I'm hoping I get a low price, but almost a name your price situation. What do I have to give you? If I found favor in your eyes, please stay. To now, at the end of the 6 years, Laban's countenance is not favorable towards him. Laban's sons have started muttering into their beards, hey, have you noticed Jacob has gotten very wealthy recently? And have you noticed everything he has came originally from Laban? There's a little bit of a self-serving motive there, because that's their inheritance they're watching walk away. But I don't think they're exaggerating. I think that there is a very real sense in which, as Jacob grows immensely in wealth, Laban's great wealth that had accumulated over those 14 years while Jacob was serving him has dwindled somewhat. And it's harmed that relationship. And so Jacob begins to hear these rumblings. He hears Laban's discontent. He's hearing what Laban's sons say about him. And as he's starting to get this sense that he's not welcome anymore, things grow to a head, and the Lord intervenes. Verse 3, then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. Jacob had been anxious to return 6 years ago. And doubtless as the relationship has deteriorated with Laban, his mind keeps going back there. It's not much longer. It's got to be getting close. As the situation falls further and further apart, the relationship gets more and more strained, maybe it's time. Maybe it's time. And then God speaks into that situation and says, yeah, Jacob, it's time. Return to the land where you came. We get a very different situation here. Before, Jacob goes and he speaks to Laban, and he says, look, send me away in peace. My time, my service is done. The time is completed. I've served you well. You've been blessed. Send me away in peace. Now he makes up his mind that it's time to leave. Watch what happens. We're not going to get all the way through this, but we're going to get a little bit into this. Watch what happens. Verse 4. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before. But the God of my father has been with me. And you know that with all my might I have served your father. Excuse me. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. If he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streaked shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. So, Jacob, rather than going and speaking to Laban, telling him, you know what, I think it's time we part ways, being forthright with him, again, I think Jacob kind of reverts into his old character a little bit here. He calls his two wives, Rachel and Leah, out to the field, out to his flock. Remember, they're not necessarily all camping together at this point. So he goes and he meets them surreptitiously out in the field, not around the tents, not where there's anybody else to be listening, calls them out to the field, and he says, hey, have you noticed? And there's this, it's so telling of the family relationship here. Have you noticed your father doesn't like me that much anymore? The God of my father has blessed me, but your father doesn't like me that much anymore. He makes this distinction here. Have you noticed? He goes on and he says, and you have seen that with all my might I have served your father. That's probably mostly true. And yet he has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. And so he goes through this. He says, look, on different occasions, Laban comes over and he says, well, let's make it the speckled ones. And, well, then all the sheep have speckled lambs. Well, let's make it the striped ones. And then they all have striped lambs. Whatever, the streaked ones, the spotted ones. And so whatever Laban does, God makes the sheep and the goats have lambs and kids that are that. And so my flocks and herds continue to grow. And God, verse 9, Jacob as much as admits what Laban's sons are accusing him of, so God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. That's the real rub here. If Laban was getting filthy rich, and also Jacob would be getting filthy rich, Laban might be jealous of him, but things wouldn't come to the head where they're at now. The real problem is Jacob's getting richer and Laban's getting poorer. And every time there's a change, whatever happens, every season when he goes out, every time Laban's out to check the flocks, he can almost see where he had this large flock and Jacob had started with this small flock. And he can almost see the numbers shifting. And it seems every time he goes and looks in the flocks, it's more and more, and Jacob's blessed, and Jacob's blessed, and Jacob's blessed, where he's losing that blessing. Verse 10, Jacob continues talking to his wives here. That's such a bizarre statement, by the way. Every time I hear that phrase come out of my mouth, it feels weird. Jacob's talking to his wives, and it happened at that time when the flocks conceived that I lifted my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leapt upon the flocks were streaked and speckled and gray-spotted. Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And he said, "Lift your eyes now and see, all the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked and speckled and gray-spotted. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, where you made your vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family." We'll find out in heaven what really happened. But I think it's interesting. Scripture records, verse 3, that God says, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you." When Jacob tells the story to his wives, there's this vision that God gives him of the speckled and spotted rams leaping on the sheep, and that God is blessing him, and that he's seen that all that Laban's doing to him, and that he's protecting him, and then, now arise and get out of this land and return to your family. He adds to it. So the question is, and there's a lively debate about this. I don't know that I have a super strong opinion one way or the other. But the question is, did Jacob have that vision, or does he make that up to help justify it as he's telling Rachel and Leah the vision? Scripture doesn't independently corroborate that one way or the other. God says that he told Jacob, "Return to the land of your family." He doesn't say he didn't tell him anything else, but he doesn't record that part. The only account we have of this vision is Jacob's account. And so Jacob is telling this story. He recounts this, and it certainly helps make the case to Leah and Rachel, whether that's Jacob's addition or whether that's God's vision that he gave him that Jacob's accurately recounting. Either way, Jacob tells them, "God came to me and told me it's time to return to the land of Canaan." Yeah, that's the piece that we're certain of. The other piece, and Jacob's not here to defend himself. Like I say, we'll know when we get to heaven. But we've seen Jacob do things like this before, where he's kind of loosey-goosey with the truth when it's to his benefit. And so I don't think it's entirely outside his character that he might decide that this case could be a little stronger when I tell Rachel and Leah if I add this piece to it. I don't think that's outside of his character entirely. Maybe that's not what happened. Maybe I'm being unfair to him, and God gave him this vision and just didn't record it twice for us because he doesn't have to. I don't know. Absolutely. This is, and that's why I say, maybe he's been growing and that's not what's happening here, and he's telling exactly what happened. Maybe that's what's happening. Because God does. He grows us and he matures us, and Jacob has had now 20 years to continue to mature from his episodes with Esau. And so he's done a lot of growing, especially since Bethel. That's the moment that really begins the change in his character, when he meets God at Bethel and has the vision, and God reaffirms the covenant, and Jacob, just out of a heart of worship, offers to give tithes to God out of all of the blessings that God would give him. So however you feel about that, the end piece here is that his wives hear that account. Verse 14, "Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, 'Is there still any portion of our inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God has said to you, do it.'" Boy, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. There is not a word here of, "But we don't want to leave our family behind. We're going to miss the relatives from Haran. We don't, are we taking advantage of Dad in this situation?" They don't stand up for their father in the slightest bit. Maybe they just know his character. But what is their concern? Absolutely. Their concern is 100%, hey, all the riches that Dad's lost, that Laban lost, well, those were going to be ours anyway, and now they're Jacob's. So, okay. There's no reason to stay here anymore because all the money's gone. Sure, we can go whenever you want to, Jacob. That is very much where their mindset is. And there's even a little bit of, again, the apple does not fall far from the tree. Listen to this statement. Is there still any portion of our inheritance for us in our family's house? What inheritance do daughters get in the culture in the day? Nada. Zip, zilch, zero. They might have gotten a small dowry gift, but it wouldn't have been a substantial piece of the inheritance. They go on a little further. For he has sold us and completely consumed our money, for all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Okay, well, they don't get an inheritance, so it's not theirs. It might have been their children's if Laban doesn't have any sons. But right back at the beginning of the chapter, we know for sure Laban has sons. None of this was their inheritance in the first place. But boy, are they quick to latch on to that. That Laban mindset that they grew up with is still right there. Yeah, hey, Jacob's got all, that sounds great because Jacob's got all the money now, so let's go anytime we want to. That Jacob, there's nothing holding us back. There's nothing else. Let's go ahead and we'll go and follow where God has called you. It's interesting to me that, so I remember, most of you know, when my wife and I got married, I was a junior in college. We probably should have been wise and waited till I graduated, but we weren't interested. And so we got married between my junior and my senior year, and we got married, and 2 weeks later, I took my poor saintly wife and moved her from Trumansburg, New York to Pensacola, Florida. Whew. Yeah. That's a long distance. And that was good for us. That was a great time in our lives, and we learned a lot about leaving and cleaving together in that season where mom and dad weren't right down the road. Both sides of our parents lived 5 miles from each other over between the lakes. And so we'd grown up in this enclave of our family, and we moved away from that, and it really drew us together, and we're thankful for that. But we had a lot of discussions about what it meant to be moving so far away from the family. So far away from all of the culture and all of the church that we grew up in and all of the things, because we grew up in church together. And all of these things, not a drop of that appears anywhere in Rachel and Leah's considerations. Their only stated concern here is, which way did the money go? Nope, that's where we're headed. Steve? Mm-hmm. Oh, there absolutely is. The wives mature, and we do see some signs of that later on. Unfortunately, the reality is we mostly see them in and around this period where they're bearing the sons and they're immediately separating from Laban's family. So it's this tight, it's the 7 years once they're married and then plus the 6 years. So there's like this 13, 14-year window where we get a lot of visibility on Rachel and Leah, and then they mostly fade into the background again. That's just the reality of the way the culture was at the time and the way the account is recorded. So we don't get to see as much, if you're talking in literary terms, you don't see as much as their character arc as you do of Jacob's. But there is definitely a piece here where they have matured some, but every indication is that they're still mired in a lot of the thought processes and struggles of the culture that they grew up in. They very much have this vision that their ability to contribute sons to the family is their primary worth. That's very problematic. It's very common in the culture of the day, but it's wildly problematic. Anytime we find our happiness, our value, our contentment in anything other than Christ, that's a problem. It leads to all kinds of issues in our lives. Because none of those things, whatever the thing is, You can pick anything you want. If your value and contentment is centered in anything other than Christ, that thing will ultimately disappoint, and your life will fall apart around it. Whatever else that might be. And you know, that's the story of Ecclesiastes. Remember Solomon? Solomon spends almost the entire book of Ecclesiastes. The richest, wisest man in the world at his time, probably the wisest man ever. And Solomon spends 90% of the book of Ecclesiastes chasing wisdom, chasing women, chasing wealth, chasing building projects, chasing everything and trying to find something that satisfies other than a right relationship with God. And you know what? The word that pops up over and over, it's like 40-some times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities. Emptiness. I chased this because I thought it was going to satisfy. But it doesn't. So I chased that because I thought it was going to satisfy. And it doesn't. And over and over and over and over again in his life. And he records that so that we can learn from that, so that we don't have to try every one of those things for ourselves. And that's kind of the pit that Leah and Rachel are in right now. Tim? Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 And you know, yeah, that's a great point. That sometimes the loudest thing about a text is what's missing. Where's Jacob going to the Lord in prayer? Where's Rachel and Leah going to the Lord in prayer? Where's the faith? And that is such a good point, because Jacob knows. The other part about this that's always spectacular to me is Jacob has the birthright and the blessing. When he returns to Canaan, the family inheritance from Abraham is his. It passes through from Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob. He's the inheritor of the double portion of all of Isaac's wealth and power and blessings. He's the inheritor of the specific blessings from God, that he will be blessed beyond measure, that the line of promise would come through him. He has all of that waiting for him. God reaffirms at Bethel that he's going to fulfill that, and even though Jacob is going to wander out of the land for a season, when he returns, God will still take care of him through that whole season, and he will be blessed. But he's got to fiddle around the edges and make sure that he's getting enough here, because that faith is lacking. Very. Yeah. Yeah, they were. The paganism that they grow up in is evident. And I think somebody said a few weeks ago, it's interesting because one of the great problems in Esau's life is that he marries these pagan wives from in and around the land of Canaan. Jacob goes back to Haran to marry daughters out of the family lineage, get those who at least know who the one true God is and not be out of the land of Canaan. But he picks up a pair of daughters who are almost indistinguishable in their character from a couple of girls who'd grown up in the land of Canaan and the paganism there. Ur of the Chaldees. Right. Yeah. And paganism is just rampant. And it's going to influence Jacob and his family here, we'll come back next week and pick up with that and find out as they leave. And ultimately, the girls, I think Barry was referring to, the girls, Rachel specifically tries to steal these pagan idols out of the household, and that stirs up a bunch more trouble. But we're going to close in prayer so the kids can come in and we can wrap up our evening tonight. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are a faithful God. You know, we see all of this chaos in the family. We see this lack of faith in Jacob's life. We see the wrong thinking in Rachel and Leah's lives. It's so easy to look at somebody else's life and see all of these things. And yet we know that we struggle with these things in our own lives. I struggle with these things day in and day out. We are faithless. We don't put our trust in you. We don't lean on you as we ought to. We seek to constantly turn around and take something that we've given you and fix it ourselves again, because that's what we think we want to do. Father, we just thank you that in spite of our faithlessness, you are faithful. We praise you for that. We just pray that you'd help us to bear that in mind and just to lean on that faithfulness and learn to trust you as we ought. We thank you and praise you in Christ's name. Amen.